Hi everybody, مساء الخير للجميع. أهلا وسهلا فيكم. My name is Lara. Welcome to Psychic Militancy, and Alana is here with us. It's 7:30 a.m. her time.
Yes.
So, comrade, thank you so much for being up early.
Thank you.
To
Thanks for having
join.
me.
Of course, I've been so excited about this, and folks are very excited about it too. I get a lot of messages. I mean, I think folks are excited about many of the episodes we do, but then sometimes they're just like, oh my gosh, I've been following their work, or so
Oh,
I got several messages about this one.
that's nice.
So yeah, so we have a lot to jump into, but folks, you know the drill. Like this, subscribe, send to a comrade, interact with it live. It makes a difference. And I have a Patreon if you want to join us and get episode releases. I did a pre-recorded episode today. I won't spill the beans about who it is yet, so you have something to be excited about. But you'd get that as pre-release if you're a Patreon. So with that aside, welcome, comrade. Thank you again for joining.
Having me.
How are you doing? How's it?
Not too
How
bad.
are you feeling?
I'm okay. It's early, so generally when I do these early sessions, then it takes my brain a little bit of time to wake up and catch up to my body. So hopefully it'll be fine. But yeah, and everything's good generally. Thank you.
Hopefully my loud voice will wake you up. It'll be like we were on a live stream last week with Adnan, and people were just like, I think Lara just speaks louder than him. I'm like, I sure do. That is correct. I do speak very loudly. So hopefully we'll wake you up. But folks, we're going to be talking about Alana's awesome book, The New Racial Regime. If you have not picked up this book, do yourself a favor, pick it up. It's awesome. It's also, I love your fucking humor. Like you're I can hear you through the book.
Oh, okay. That nobody's ever said that to me. I really like that, because I always get the impression that people don't think I'm that funny. So I'm happy that that's come through.
Totally.
Maybe sarcastic humor.
Yes. Yeah. And I love when you take the digs at these assholes and these clowns that are like end up, but I love it. I like found myself laughing, as I was reading it. And so we can get more into that. But I also wanted to show folks that, so Alana and I are both published by Pluto, and the orange color scheme really works together. Actually, you were the one who pointed that out to me.
Yes.
You remember? Yeah, you were like,
no, because orange was such a theme of conversation with Pluto, because I had in my head this idea. I didn't want a subtitle for the book, so I just wanted it to be called The New Racial Regime. In fact, I wanted to be called The Racial Regime. But anyway, apparently newness is a thing, right? So The New Racial Regime, and I wanted one of those orange covers like from the 1970s, just like it was always orange for some reason, and just the title with no design. But that was a complete no-no. So then we had to have a whole thing. And then I said, it has to be orange. Anything else you want to put on it, whatever, but it has to be orange.
So you were the one who started the orange craze. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I love it. I mean, it's fantastic. So, but I'm just glad we're Pluto buddies. We're also buddies as the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. We're part of the founding collective. So we get to interact a lot, but this is going to be like one of the, I think, the most extended conversations that we've had about Alana's work, which again, I think most of you here have probably interacted with Alana's work. I'm going to, in the show notes, there's some pieces that she's written that I found very helpful, just from a sort of a structural analysis perspective. I think I can rely on you a lot for that, and I trust your analysis. But this is this piece is really, it's really powerful. And you and I were talking offline about like, maybe we can situate it for folks. Like, where does this, where do you come to say, all right, I'm going to channel this into a book that, you wanted it to be called The Racial Regime. I want to get into that about what you mean by what you lay out, especially if folks have not read it. But maybe we start there. Like, how did it become the time to do this?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I've talked about this a few times, and people have maybe listen to other podcast interviews that I've given. So forgive me if this is a boring story by this point, but I think it's relevant. particularly due to the resurgence of, well, I don't think it's really resurgent. I think it's constant, but let's say the uptick in hysteria around what's now being called racial communism. But if you look in the book, you'll understand that it actually comes from James Lindsay, who's one of the anti-critical race theory warriors, as I refer to them in the book, who spoke about race Marxism in a book that I insist was self-published by Lindsay. So he didn't actually get a book contract. But anyway, so this
See, that's part of the funny.
Yeah. No, I like those. It's true. I do like to take my digs at these kinds of clowns. But anyway, so there's this kind of red thread that goes through. And the story that I tell in the prologue that I've told before is that there was some hesitancy in some parts around publishing this book. And the reason was that they thought that the furor around critical race theory and woke was going to go away. And here we have just like a couple of days ago, AOC coming out with this absolute bullshit about, woke 1.0 was hysterical or whatever. I mean, so we just see this as a constant. But so the book started off as this response to the so-called war on critical race theory. And as I'm saying, it took a while to get published because some people thought that it wasn't going to be a big deal. They kept saying, you'll publish it, and then, everybody will have already forgotten about this story. Anyway, so it started. Because it kind of took time to get going, and then of course Pluto did come on board, and that's absolutely fantastic. Things kind of changed in my head around what my interests were, and other people published really good books on, the kind of nucleus of the problem with the so-called war on critical race theory. Like there's a book that I cite in my own book by David Theo Goldberg, very, very important race critical theorist at UC Irvine. Also Victor Ray's book on it's on critical race theory, but he uses the introduction as an opportunity to talk about what this moral panic around critical race theory was. So by the time I was actually getting started with my book, I was less kind of committed to that very question alone. And at the same time, I'd been developing my interest in Cedric Robinson's work really around 2018 and getting into trying to understand what he means by racial capitalism. And maybe we can get into that later, but really a lot of people do not understand what Cedric Robinson meant by racial capitalism, as we've seen just this week with the publication of August Nims's book on Black Marxism, which I listened to the interview that he did with Jared Bull the other day. And I have to say, well, maybe we should park it. But what I'm trying to say is that there's still a huge amount of work to be done. And particularly not just on, Robinson's actually quite, a lot of people say that he didn't actually talk about racial capitalism that much in Black Marxism. And you kind of have to situate it in the context out of which he was writing, but much more extensively in his other works, right? So I was really interested in, well, what else did this guy write? Because really Robinson, as many people said, he published Black Marxism, and it's important to state that the subtitle of the book is really more important than the main heading, which is The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. He publishes it in 1983 with Zed Books, which is a British-based publisher. And due to kind of, US-centric whatever, there was not very much attention to this book that was published over there, like in the old country kind of thing. And Robin Kelly talks about this in his preface to the new edition, the edition that came out in 2000, and then it comes out again, I think, in 2021 in the Penguin edition. But people hadn't really engaged with his other work. And one of his students, the brilliant political theorist H.L.T. Kwon, edited a collection of Robinson's writings that also appears with Pluto, and I think it came out in 2019. So there's many more writings there to engage with. And then most importantly, and this is to make a short story long, as one of our friends, Dr. CBS, likes to say, I think that's always really funny. Because it's really long at this point. You get this really brilliant theorization, or at least introduction of an idea rather than theorization, I think, of the racial regime in his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which he publishes in 2007. And when I came to that idea, that's when a lot of things kind of crystallized for me. And it was interesting that I already started to think that the idea of the racial regime was really apposite for talking about things like the war on critical race theory and the war on woke, when I heard an interview with Robin D.G. Kelly on, I think, the Conjuncture podcast, in which he literally says, the racial regime is a perfect, way for conceptualizing the war on woke. And so that led me to think with Robinson about many things, but really about what I tried to explain is the way in which what he calls this racial regime, and there are many racial regimes in one sense, but they're not really new. They're, rather than being new, they're recalibrated or refabricated is a word that he uses as well. And they're constantly, and he uses the stitching metaphor, they're constantly pieced together from old cloth, but additional new cloth kind of added onto it in this patchwork of what he calls memory and the immutable. And he sets this up as very, very important for understanding really racial capitalism. Now, he doesn't really spell this out in his work, but other scholars such as Joshua Myers, who wrote a very important biography of Robinson, Yusuf al-Baluchi also, and others talk about how you really, in order to understand what racial capitalism is, but more so how it's recapitulated over time, you have to understand this racial regime, which is kind of the driver through narrative, discourse, representation, and as I say in the book, often just lies. This is how racial capitalism is recursively recapitulated over time. And it kind of helps us understand, what do we mean when we say race is socially constructed? Because as Patrick Wolf, for example, said, and many others also said, but he says it quite nicely in his book, Traces of History, race has to be brought into being. There's no point in saying race is socially constructed. Like every single student, even high school student, can rattle that off today. But how is it socially constructed? And the idea of the racial regime really helps us. And when I read your book, as I think I said to you in messages earlier this week, the idea of psychic intrusions is really interesting for thinking about, one dimension of how racial regimes are recalibrated.
Yeah. I mean, this is where you and I, I kept thinking about, number one is making it feel new feels like it's part of the strategy. Like you lay out in a very accessible way, I think Robinson's work, an incredibly accessible way, and animate it and operationalize it with these examples that you have. You bring it into being in this way without then saying, here's this new formation and that's what it is. To the contrary, you're like, this is, it's a lie and it's a disavowal to think this isn't a continuous lineage. It just shows up in different ways. But it seemed to me like this trying to make it look new. Like this is a new thing. This is a new thing is part of its selling point, which is what made me think about it's a psychic inversion, which is a psychic, the main way that I talk about in my book about how psychic intrusions happen are through psychic inversions. Like they ask you to invert material reality and accept that as the starting point. So I wondered if you could say just a little bit more about this, like why the need to make it look new when there's this entire, continuous history that might have different instantiations or look differently, let's say in the settler colony you're at versus the settler colony I'm in. But follows a similar logic.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Robinson says, and this is the piece that I think is really important, and this is why I sort of sighed also when August Nimps was talking to Jared Bull and he was saying that Robinson wasn't interested in what was actually happening in Black politics, as in activism, which I thought was crazy, because literally what he talks about, so in Forgeries, what he makes absolutely clear is the racial regime undergoes this, this process of reinvention, if you like, or recalibration in my terms, always in response to opposition from below. Because people who are, basically experiencing racism or surviving under context of colonization, enslavement, and genocide, and so on, are not going to simply take how they are characterized, right? So if somebody's calling you, like the Zionists call Palestinians, what was the term, human animals or all cockroaches and all this kind of stuff, nobody's going, oh, well, thank you very much. That's a very, that's an apt description. Obviously, they're going to fight back. And when people are being, beaten, tortured, etc., they are going to fight back. That's the human condition. And so obviously, people who are negatively racialized, in other words, are not going to just accept the terms of their racialization. They're going to fight back. And so this is why the racial regime undergoes this constant recalibration. It has to adapt itself to circumstances, and it has to adapt itself to opposition specifically. But then also there are different kinds of contexts and locations, spaces and times in which racism takes effect. So one of the things I talk about is this idea of racism having a time, which is now past. We're now, post-race. This is something from the past. And you people, who keep going on about it, you are, you just won't let it go. You're too attached to it. You've got this kind of need to talk about race all the time. But we've already moved on, right? That's part of, I guess, what you're calling psychic inversions here. And the racial regime literally speaks in that language, of being past racism or being onto something else, and new people being stuck in the past. So time is, utilized in that way, weaponized, if you like, in order to reassert, racial rule in various contexts. But then I guess the other part of it is that these things are kind of coterminous. So in different places, even, geographically very, beside each other, things that are happening at the same time in the same space, racism can look very, very different, as we know, right? So people experience things, the same person can experience different forms of racism in very different ways in the same day. And we know, so that's part of how, and I think just understanding this need for constant obfuscation, and that's part of what Robinson tries to show. He goes, the manufacture of race as an idea, because it's a lie, is necessarily chaotic, right? It's necessarily contradictory because it is intrinsically so. But then that's part of its success, if you like. So the kind of the chaos and contradiction and the confusing nature of race is also a mechanism for literally confusing people and attacking that opposition from below in. And so part of what we, people on the left often talk about how the racists are much better than this than we are. They're much more organized. They're much more this. They're much more that. But literally obviously that ignores the forces stacked against us. Exactly. It also ignores, but it also ignores the fact that necessarily this stuff is made to confuse us. And so then when people say infighting and why are you fighting about identity politics, because there's much other bigger stuff happening that you should really be attentive to, what is completely ignored is that mechanism. It's a kind of, again, in your terms and Dylan's terms, a counterinsurgent mechanism to confuse people. And that's part of its, power.
Right, exactly. It's part of the reason why one of the affect states is confusion that I talk about as psychic, because it takes you off course, and then you're engaging on a whole different terrain that's already been established for you, and you're, most importantly, untethered from material reality and disconnected from the actual fight, because now I'm doing this, Dylan talks about this as semantics, right? And this is the sort of lexical warfare that's involved. But it made me think while you were talking about that, these recalibrations also, I'm thinking here about implicating, rightfully so, liberals in all this, and sort of kind of taking very, again, very funny pot shots at the disconnect, like the seeming like difference between the fascistic forces and liberals. Well, and while they might have different approaches to things, they're both needed to stabilize this racial regime or this recalibration, like you're talking about it. But I was also thinking about, I took a note about when it's recalibrating constantly and reconstituting itself, really in the ways that power does. It reconstitutes itself right in front of our eyes. It also then becomes especially vulnerable to capture. Like people then, because then you can like DEI or something like that. Like here it is, that can look like a contradiction. Like, well, no, the fascists aren't going to want this, or the, power is not going to want it, or a racial regime. Why would it have this if it weren't changing? And it's just like, no, actually, if we learn to read the way that it recalibrates, reconstitutes itself, is that this ability to expand and capture all of that, it is a part of what you're saying, until it doesn't, until it fucking claps down so fucking hard. It's just like, wait, this is a little too much.
That reminds me of something that the Palestinian sociologist who works here at the University of Sydney, Ihab Shalbak, talks about. He moves from Umayya Cable's idea of compulsory Zionism to mandatory Zionism, because he says that's exactly what you're talking about in the context of, let's say, first you have the use of DEI in order to kind of massage in, the IHRA, for example, into its policies, and obsequiously kind of use anti-racist mechanisms in order to kind of install this new regime, right? But kind of, again, obsequiously, or, more by kind of soft power, let's say. And then it literally claps back through the imposition of criminalization, that's the mandatory part, and I thought that was a really neat way. He's apparently publishing a paper on this that I think will be really, really useful for everybody. But it's really, I think that's exactly what you're saying. Like, it's okay until it's not okay. And then the thing is to be attentive to the people who were saying all along that it wasn't okay. So that's like, for example, I think I quote Daruba bin Wahad's, critique of BLM, right? When he talks about, why were they asking for Black Lives to Matter? And I thought, at the time, I think if somebody, especially if I had said that at the time, I think it would have been beyond the pale. But I think, he had a long experience that led him to make that comment. Yeah. He was noticing it all along, what was going to happen. And now we have, exactly AOC coming out and, shitting on it, basically, without even thinking about the people who were kind of making those points within the Black Lives Matter movement at the time. Many of them have ended up either in jail or dead.
That's right.
And now we can kind of laugh about woke 1.0, poo-pooing it.
Right. Exactly. And just the conscription of all these people, like an AOC or something, into that, right? Which is interesting, because you do make this point about time. This is, for me, where it does come in. And this is very Fanonian, right? Like, it's not just about the present moment. It's about reaching backwards into your past and into your future, of course, and making sure that those things are on lockdown, because that's the rewriting. What you're talking about is like, those people were clued in then. They are dead or imprisoned now, much like, with the Black Panther Party. It's the same sort of thing that we're, and it's not enough that someone like AOC can just be like, right now, this is it. And it's just to reach into the past and also insist that it's like breaking the ability for people to actually connect the dots by rehistoricizing the shit they might have gotten wrong. Just like with Iran right now, like, you can see, like, there are folks who are just like, I'm seeing this moment right now, and it's not just for the moment it is. I'm rewriting all the shit I got wrong before. And that's the thing that power wants to attack as well, is the abilities to do that and not collapse this time issue and then go back and rewrite history or something like that. It's just like, if anything else, everything that's today is proving why we fucking were screaming into the wind back then, and you all were mobilizing this woke shit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many telling moments that we can track. Sometimes you need the kind of the benefit of hindsight in order to piece it all together. And I think one of the things that I was doing in this book, which made it actually immensely hard to write, is probably the hardest thing I've ever written, is trying to do what Stuart Hall referred to as history of the present. So you're literally writing history as it's happening. And I think mainly in my work, what I try to do is not necessarily bring something completely new, because anyway, I don't agree that that's possible. I think, there's nothing really new, but it's kind of bringing you to see something that you kind of knew was already there. But it's like putting the different pieces together. And that's why it was difficult, because you had to take from all these kind of different iterations of things happening at the same time and kind of put them into juxtaposition with each other, so it became clear what is actually going on. So I think one of the examples, if we want to get into kind of people that I critique in the book, was, the example of Kimberly Crenshaw, who has spent, a number of years now going on all kinds of podcasts. And I believe she's brought out an autobiography recently. I haven't read it. In which she's talking about a lot on the attacks on critical race theory, which again is what led me to write this book. I was really concerned with what that meant politically, not so much for, bemoaning what's happening to the Liberal Academy, which I think anyway is dead in the water. And I think, a part of what I do in the book is also to incorporate the critiques that people had of the institutionalization of Black and ethnic studies. I mean, this is not unproblematic, right? So my interest in this was less about, trying to save, even though we are all victims of these attacks as people who work in universities, obviously, it's not easy to have to try to survive and continue doing your job while you're being attacked for the very things that you do. So that wasn't my interest in it. While I understand that wasn't my interest in it. But we have a Kimberly Crenshaw, who many people obviously have looked to as one of the major theorists of critical race theory, and in particular intersectionality, for several decades now, spend this time during the genocide talking about the attacks on critical race theory without ever connecting it to the fact that students on both of the campuses where she has, I believe, endowed chairs, or at least chairs, were being literally beaten to a pulp by police, called in by the administration of these universities. And it's actually Mamadou Tall who spoke about this in relation to Cornell when he was there, that Crenshaw came to give a talk at the university. And while everything was going on, which led to him having to flee the United States, pursued by ICE for his activism against Palestine, as a Black student, she had absolutely nothing to say about this at all, or the genocide in general, never mind the actual protest of the students. And I think it's not to shit on an individual, because I mean there are all kinds of individuals, and there are many critical race scholars who were speaking out and are speaking out. But what it led me to think about, rather than kind of dwell on those micro stories that we all know about, to think about the enterprise of critical race theory itself as a discipline, or as a way of seeing the world, and actually what it's doing, right? And what it's allowing us not to see, right? So when you actually get into the foundations of critical race theory, as I do in the third chapter of the book, you look at how it's really a way of thinking about the US state and its relationship to racially minoritized people that leaves the wider global picture completely out of the story. So while it has been taken and run with by various people, for example, Indigenous scholars, there's a really interesting work that I discussed in the book by a close collaborator of mine, Ali Megji, creating a theoretical synergy between CRT and decolonial thought. I mean, a lot of things can be done with CRT, but foundational CRT itself completely ignores imperialism and completely ignores colonialism. And I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure how I'm connecting this to your question, but it's one of those things that I think is really useful for us to think about the actual tools that we think are emancipatory, and the limitations of those when we're trying to think about actually how they can be repurposed in really, really worrying ways to, again, to confuse us.
Right. Well, this is the capture piece as well, right? Yeah. But I think part of, actually, you're saying something further, and I think you do that in the book too, is like, and maybe this is what you're speaking to about what was hard about it, is like, there's something about the practice and method of sharpening our analytical tools. And I think when we are under attack by state forces, there are ways in which we might be conscripted into or seduced into laundering things out of emotional blackmail, right? So my dear friends, Avgi Sekotopulu and Anne Pellegrini, have a book called Gender Without Identity, in which they talk about this in terms of transness. Like, because trans people are under attack, there are these ways in which people are forced, emotionally coerced into taking positions, like through lawfare or through like arguing through these systems that are fundamentally don't actually tell us anything about gender or about patriarchy or about these larger structures that are at the heart of the oppression. Instead, you end up talking about really liberal, actually, positions. You take liberal positions because you're blackmailed into them. I think I hear you saying this version of that. And I know that's really hard to be like, to take something and say, there's something really important politically about this attack. But that doesn't mean that we can't be looking at CRT and like understand it as having come out of a particular tradition within empire, restabilizing in some ways, refocusing on it. And like you're saying about Crenshaw, also creating targets on more militant positions.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? By kind of dividing and ruling.
Right.
I think
and
this is
go ahead. Sorry. No, go for it.
No, please.
I was going to say there's also a reason There's also a reason why certain, theories then become, I think, accepted, quote unquote, or brought in. I mean, that's a more crass way of saying it because it's more complicated, as we were saying. But I'd love to hear more.
I think it's interesting because I think actually they're not accepted, which is the interesting part, because then it's like, well, why aren't you more militant? Like, they're not accepting you anyway.
It's so true,
right? This is what I find really interesting, and I think this is where I try to dig down. Like in the 4th chapter on colonizing, decolonization, what's it called? I can't even remember the title of my own chapter, where I get into how indigeneity and the indigenization agenda is
capturing indigeneity, colonizing, decolonization.
Thank you. This is what happens when you become senior and you can't remember things. This kind of agenda of capturing indigeneity within settler colonial academic institutions, which is part of what I do in that chapter. There's a lot of it. The reason I do it in that chapter, which maybe we can get into after this, is in order to attack the idea of Jewish indigeneity to Palestine, right? So there's a kind of a way in which I connect all these things together. But I think it's really, really interesting because at the moment, it's not over the last few years, let's say, you have in so-called Australia a kind of a real drive of institutions to indigenize, and a very, very top-down approach through the institutions of installing a lot of kind of indigenous leaders, academic leaders, to become the people who are going to be responsible for this indigenization of the curriculum of the university, of reassessing the colonial past. And you think, this is great, this is fantastic, this is what they're doing, right? But at the same time, this stuff is actually really under threat. So we know that as soon as it's given, it can be taken back, it can be taken away, it can be gotten rid of. And you've seen that already happen very, very quickly. You had the so-called racial reckoning of 2020. And then within a couple of years, you had the closure of programs, you had the firing of academics, you had the wholesale kind of dismantling of, for example, Black studies just now at Birmingham City University having been built up, over several years, because it's no longer useful. So then it does beg the question of what people are actually doing. And what are they doing in trying to do, which on one level is very understandable, like this idea of, well, at least we will have this, right? So thinking about the indigenization agenda in Australian universities, what it's being used for, forgive me, is extremely terrifying. Because really, thinking about my own context, I work in Western Sydney, which is very, very big region where it's it's very diverse. It's the most multicultural region of so-called Australia, and there are significant Indigenous communities as well. Now there's a huge amount of speculation, land speculation happening, in which the university is involved, and in which you can see, and I tried to point to this in the book, and it's dangerous terrain to get into, but in which you can see this indigenization agenda being kind of captured in order to do that work of literally settling, colonizing, extracting from stolen Indigenous land, right? You can see, for example, now, and there's of course the connection to the genocide because of the installing of, or the establishment of weapons companies in the region. There's a new airport that's going to be open soon, because at the moment the airport in Sydney is very, very, very handy for me, centrally located, easy to leave. But now it's going to be out in this western region. So of course, big new airport, lots of opportunity for business of the kind that Australia has always been adept at, right? So mining and extracting from stolen land in order to produce the very, the weaponry that's used to annihilate Indigenous peoples in other places, right? And people here, when we think about, of course, the link to, the whole kind of criminal punishment system, thinking about, my university opening a massive police academy just last year, right? So all of these pieces put together, and then we know, then we could connect it to social work and the endemic theft of Indigenous children, which is worse today in terms of numbers proportionate to the population than it was during the so-called era of the stolen generations. So all of these pieces, right? Social work being, I mean, I found out recently, one of the ways it's very difficult, as you'll probably know, to migrate to Australia, right? So you can only come under one of these programs that is, very like the Canadian system that you're more familiar with. One of the ways in which you can actually, there's a route to permanent residency and then citizenship is if you come from another country to study social work, because there's massive need in social workers. So people are coming, like a student of mine from Nepal, right, came here to be a social worker because, you need more social workers to police and manage the families of Indigenous peoples. So all of these pieces for me are connected in my head and run through acknowledgement of country that's in the signature of every single, email.
Yes.
Which only a few years ago, by the way, never happened.
Wasn't the case.
No. And now it's mandatory up and down the institution.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think I love that you're just like, this is dangerous waters to get into, because it's thorny, because when you live in a world of settler colonization and extraction, I think, and also, a world that does take people away from militancy. And therefore they end up saying, oh, this is better than nothing. But it's precisely for this reason. What you're saying is just like, hold up, we need to retain our ability to understand the political project behind this, which is why I love your book, because you're like, this is a political project. And you can't, it's like, that's the parallel to like Amaya's book is the same thing about the ADL. Like, look at the political project behind this, and the political project even of indigenization. And I love that chapter title, actually, with the indigenization in this way, is that it really actually does nothing about indigeneity or land back. In fact, what it does is create a system that says this is the right way to do this, and it puts a spotlight on those of us, and particularly our Indigenous comrades, who are like, this shit means nothing to me. I want my land back. Right? And so then you have the good Indigenous person and the bad Indigenous person, just like you have the good Palestinian, good Arab, and the bad Arab, bad Palestinian. And that's why normalizers, every Israeli wants to be in conversation with a normalizer, because not only does it do that, but it also sets up who your target is, who's the militant in this. And so it's a displacement, right? It's a displacement. I mean, in the settler colony where you live, it's a displacement from like the ongoing, egregious attacks against Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples, and not at all caring about fucking treaty rights. It's the same thing in Aotearoa, as you know, with our Maori comrades. And like, you can say every acknowledgement you want. Kim Tallbear has a beautiful piece about this, where there's one thing about like yes, you acknowledge, but like, what the fuck's the point of an acknowledgement if you don't understand this is part of a larger political? And like, okay, so then what does it mean? Are you going to, give back the land that your university is on? Or is this like, that's the part of capture, and also about defanging something, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Just like completely domesticating it.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, it is dangerous terrain to get into, because also these are things that were called for by, and are called for by, some Indigenous people. And this is the debate that I get into, not the debate, but this is the kind of the recent history that I get into in that chapter around the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum, that a lot of people around the world lauded as this very brave experiment in what they thought was Indigenous self-governance. And what you actually uncover very quickly when you actually look into it is that it was nothing of the kind. And in fact, the way it was sold, so just to inform everybody, what readers? No, we're online. I'm getting confused. To inform people about what it was Australians were asked to vote in a referendum about whether there would be a permanent Indigenous representative body to the Parliament. And the reason this necessitated a referendum is that it required a change to the constitution, right? In order to make this permanent, because there have been representative bodies before, but they came and went, kind of thing. So this idea would be to make it permanent. But the way in which it was sold to the Australian public by those who were in favor of it was like, don't worry, you won't lose anything. Because what the right wing was saying, don't vote for this thing because it'll pass, and tomorrow an Indigenous person will knock on your door and say, give me your house, it's mine.
Right.
So that's the way it was sold, and that's why it basically, they lost the referendum. More than 60% voted against it because the racist campaign against it was effective. At the same time, when we understand how it was sold by liberals, like, don't worry, this isn't going to happen, you understand that it was completely ineffective. And in fact, what they were proposing would be this representative body of Indigenous leaders to be handpicked by the sitting government, who may be consulted on certain affairs, but whose opinion wouldn't necessarily have to be taken into account.
Right.
I mean, that's literally the limitation of what the thing was, right? Right from the get-go. And so obviously, militant, what have I lost? Oh, an AirPod, sorry.
Yes, it's okay. It's a hazard. It's a hazard of doing this. I've done this before where it just like popped off my ear entirely.
It's literally gone. Okay, I think I'll have to operate without them. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay.
Can you hear?
So more militant Black people, Indigenous people here, were against it because obviously it was going to be a complete ruse. And they said the point was that in order to be recognized by the state, one had to in turn recognize the legitimacy of the colonial state, right? So this was a two-way street, which is, by the way, the problem that more militant Indigenous people have with treaty as well, because it requires a recognition of the legitimacy of colonialism, which they're unable to accept. But the argument in liberal quarters got stuck, right, in this notion of, yes, but it's better than nothing, right?
Right.
And that was exactly the problem, exactly the problem that you're trying to point out.
Yeah. I mean, you're already, by doing that, you're already accepting the inversion. You're accepting the inversion of the sovereignty of a settler colony and so the parameter of the settler is already accepted up front. It also shows, I mean, and I wonder if you could get into this, you say in your book, like, fascism is the new racial regime. I'd love to, it's connecting in my mind to this and the ways that this sort of liberal, pretzeling themselves to actually think that this is better than nothing, when it's like that better than nothing still stabilizes the futures of settlers and the futures of fascists over Indigenous life, actually, because you are in saying you won't lose anything. For me, what I hear in that is a re-identification with the settler state and the social order of that and the racial regime that constitutes it. Because and what if you do lose something? Like, what if you did actually, like, that's what you don't want to contend with.
That's exactly right. And I think it actually happened when on the day of the referendum in Australia, they also force you to vote or you get a fine. So I went up to the council to vote, and the woman at the door literally sold me this. She's put a leaflet in my hand and said, read it very carefully. You won't lose anything if you vote. So I just did a double click and I went back to her and I said, excuse me, I thought we were voting in order for things to change. And then she said, but I just want to reassure you. And I was like, no, that I think you're getting the wrong person here. But it was really interesting when I confronted her with kind of exactly what you've just said. She was like, I have never thought about it this way. And then when I went in to vote, and then you kind of go in one door and then you come out the other door. And then she ran up to me again and she's like, I've really thought about what you had to say. And she was really, you could see that it was sitting with her, and she was really, really uncomfortable with her impetus to calm white settler feelings down around this issue.
Yes. Yeah. Which stabilizes that social order. And does the work, right? It does the work for that. I mean, fascists have can come down hard, and liberals have their pamphlets where they explain to you that, in fact, actually getting rid of a settler colonial system you won't have to lose anything. I'm like, both of them are based on fucking disavowals and racist ideas, of course, about and belonging property. I mean, all the stuff that you take up really beautifully in the book. But I wonder if this is a good segue into that. I mean, there's a lot of things that struck me in reading your book, but that sort of sentiment and statement of fascism is today's racial regime.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm thinking, of course, here when we think about what's happening in Cuba, of course, what's Zionism. I mean, that's, probably the most fascistic, sort of outwardly fascistic display we have that can't happen without the support of the fascistic support of empire. But can you tell us a little more?
Without the fascistic support of empire, I mean, can you just elaborate a little bit on? I wasn't completely clear on what you were.
I was talking about Zionism as for me, in my mind, the most like egregious display of fascist racial regime, but it can't, that ability to do that can't happen without empire, right? Because empire is
exactly. No, I think that's exactly really, really important. So part of what I mean, many of us speak about this, but I think it's really urgent to speak about this currently because of the return, I guess, or maybe it was always there, but I think the outward kind of blatancy of a new kind of, and it's not just in the US, of course, in this US idea that, Israel is actually running the United States, or in a video that I saw just the other day, we should really call, we should call Australia Osrail because it's being run by Israel, etc. We have this kind of return of this idea that the Jews are kind of, manufacturing everything and running everything, which is really, really handy, right? Because it completely lets empire and its sub-imperial helpers like Australia and other places completely off the hook. And more so lets Europe off the hook, right? Because this is the start and finish of all of this, right? And nobody really, I mean, I think this is part of the problem with the kind of the dominance of, I mean, it's part of the problem of the dominance of the US empire, but also in kind of academic and activist kind of transnationalism, the dominance even there, even though, so many fantastic and amazing thinkers come out of the North American context, but then they kind of, it dominates and floods the zone in the sense that we don't actually hear about, the effect of all of this in other places. And all of the pieces of the puzzle need to be put together. And to think about what I'm really interested in this book and generally is to think about what Zionism and what it brings together for power, what it allows to continue and persist, right? Because I think the last thing that we want to see, or at least that we should want to see, is the demise of Zionism, but the fortification of empire by the same token through what's now being allowed to happen, the infiltration or even the hegemony of these white supremacist voices, apparently on the side of Palestinian liberation, but really, I think, utilizing this narrative, and it's a convenient narrative for them at the moment, which they could easily drop, by the way, in order to sell this idea of America first, or Australia first, or Britain first, or whatever it might be. And I think this is fascism in operation, right? Because, of course, fascism also relies on these kinds of lies, the lie of race, first and foremost. And I think part of the problem that, many Black radicals have spoken about is the fact that European theorizations of fascism don't take into account the importance, the centrality of racialism to the entire fascist order, right? It's not just about, a particular constellation of capitalism or particular, needs of capitalism at a certain point. When you talk about it and you talk about it in the absence of thinking about race as the ideological driver of capitalism in many ways, or at least the kind of the ideological structure through which capitalism can grow and expand globally, then you're completely missing the picture. And here's so too again, right? This is actually what's being fortified. The racial white supremacist project is being fortified through, on both sides, both the right wing full embrace of Zionism, and to a smaller but growing extent, the right-wing attack on Zionism that we're now seeing in the name of the advancement of the white supremacist project.
Right, exactly, which is why I'm always like, Tucker Carlson, not our
Yeah.
friend. Candace Owens, not our friend. Like, this shit is like, you know, this is not going to be where liberation is had. To the contrary, they're, again, back to this idea of stabilizing. What is being stabilized here? Rather than, are you, is what we're seeing an antagonistic relationship to the power structure, to the racial regime that's at play, or a stabilization of it? Like you're saying, when you say fascism is the racial regime, if you're looking at how these voices or personalities or whatever, like, are they doing anything to disrupt, dismantle, or cut the head off of fascism?
No,
They're
nothing.
fascists themselves.
I mean, I think it's really, really interesting to think through. As it's happening in real time, it's actually quite difficult. And, we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
I think, when you hear somebody like Tucker Carlson have concern for Palestinians, and even if we want to admit that he has general humane consideration for people suffering under genocide, and that can be true, at the same time that his narrative is for the furtherance of US empire,
Yes.
of a particular kind, right? And I think that leaves intact the actual project. And it's not just because of the materiality, like the material needs of the Zionist entity to continue, which relies on empire, but I think it's also because because these two things are not really separate, right? They're difficult to disentangle. Like, one is the fortification of one. I'm not sure really where I'm going with this, like, because I think almost the folding in of the logic of Zionism and the back and forth of it, right? The kind of the similarity of the logic that you see operating within Zionism in a very acute way and very crystallized and a way that is very apparent to many of us is kind of just a distillation of a centuries-long project that has become much more vague to us because of the kind of counterinsurgent practices of the racial regime that we've been talking about, right?
Yes.
So we don't really see it. And in fact, sadly, I had to listen on 2 occasions to a Palestinian academic come to Australia to talk about Palestine and to say, and I heard it twice, and I thought once, okay, but the second time repeating the same thing, and a year and something had passed, and he repeated the same thing, and he said, why can't Israel be more like Australia, like more multicultural, like this? You have a successful multicultural society. So even leaving aside the fact that, you're basically allowing for the continuation of the Zionist entity, which I thought was strange coming from a Palestinian, that's a complete lie when you're sitting on stolen indigenous land. And what does successful multiculturalism mean in this context? That narrative, that discourse is used in order to sell the furtherance of the settler colony. So, I mean, that's just another example from another angle of the same problem of saying, well, let's deal with Palestinian suffering in order to allow the US empire to continue or the white nation to flourish.
Absolutely. And here's the thing. I think these points that you're making, oftentimes what's lodged against us is they are pedantic points that you're making, or sloganeering, or whatever the fuck people say. But like, these are actually fundamental points around how empire and the identification with empire, or the stabilization of the future of that, that's actually the mechanics of it. That's part of, I think, what you lay out in the book, like the mechanics of how the shit happens. And this is the way it happens, is that we let our guard down.
Yes.
And we take in the lies that power tells, as though anything can be. That's what I mean about it's not pedantic when you say nothing like this can happen on stolen land. That is a necessary return for us, right? This is the repetition I talk about, precisely for that point, because it's so easy to get taken into this and say, oh, there's a softer version of this that looks like this, and it's just like, stolen land is fucking stolen land is fucking stolen land, right? Like, Canadians like to think of themselves as the nicest people in the world. I don't give a fuck. You're still a settler, and you stole land, and you murdered Indigenous children, and we're digging up their graves, or the murdered and stolen Indigenous women every single day in so-called Canada. Like, this shit's not shit of the past. No. And any letdown we have, like that we let our guard down, is just an excuse for that structure to continue its work on us. It needs all of us to join in those. It can look like sloppy ways, but there's actually something much deeper happening. And I think that's part of your book. You're just like, I feel like you throughout the book, you're just like, here's the thing on the surface, but like, hey guys, like this is the shit that's actually happening. Like, look at the logic, look at the structure, look at the history, look at how it looks like right now. You know,
I think that's right. And I think, you know, being the person, and you're definitely one of these people as well who calls that out, it can be really, you become really, really unpopular. And I think one of the things that I use the 5th chapter to do is to argue against definitions. And this is in the context of, you know, again, what Ehab Shabak calls mandatory Zionism, the imposition of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism everywhere. And the response to that being in many quarters, well, let's either go for a softer definition of anti-Semitism, that a less like a Zionist light definition, like the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which I discuss in the book via, you know, the critique of Samir Abdel Noor, for example. Or let's also have our own definitions, right? Please, let's have, for example, a definition of anti-Palestinian racism that can sit alongside at least the definition of anti-Semitism. And I argue strenuously against that in the book. And when I wrote that, I did pause, because I thought, well, you know, who am I to kind of tell Palestinians what they should have and what they shouldn't have and all the rest of it, obviously. But at the same time, I feel really vindicated today, because in the last few weeks, what we've had in the context of this absolute shit show of the Royal Commission against Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion that's been going on here in so-called Australia in response to the Bondi killings, which is, it's just literally, it's like this kind of parade of Zionist after Zionist coming through and sitting in this room and crying about somebody wearing a Palestine t-shirt or a watermelon tattoo, or you know what, like that's what it is. I mean, to the extent that even the commissioner had to reprimand some people for sending Islamophobic messages to a representative from a Palestinian advocacy group. But all of this is still happening. And, you know, anyway, so in that context, one of the government's responses has been that universities across so-called Australia have to adopt definitions of racism. And this is really, you know, the kind of the intrusion, you know, so they've started with anti-Indigenous racism at the top, which was ignored until now, right? Oh, yes, we have some Indigenous people. They suffer racism. Okay. Anti-Indigenous racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism definitions in that order, right? Have to be incorporated by universities, and this is mandated. So there's no way around it. And obviously, this is a way to get your IHRA definition, which not all universities have accepted, in through this mechanism, perversely using a recent study of the experience of racism, you know, experiences of racism by students at university, where 81% of Indigenous students said that they experienced daily racism. You're using this in a very, very perverse manner in order to mandate Zionism via the IHRA, or, you know, whatever other definition is going to be incorporated by these universities. And so and Islamophobia by the same token, although of course not anti-Palestinian racism. Right. But I thought, but you know, why not? I can imagine a scenario, because it doesn't say you only have to adopt these three. I mean, they're not going to say if you want a definition of anti-Black racism or anti-Palestinian racism that you can't. They probably let you. And so in this way, you have this proliferation of definitions of racism now mandated and incorporated into the policy and structure of universities, and this being used in order to basically drive Zionism through, because at the same time, you've got this special envoy on anti-Semitism setting up bodies to kind of monitor and manage and mandate anti-Semitism education throughout education in very similar manner that you have already in the United States. And all of this is used and packaged together. So I'm really pleased to come back to my point that I strenuously argued against definitions as a response to the mandating of Zionist definitions because I think I was vindicated through this, because this is going to be the vehicle for which, coming back to things like the war on critical race theory, right? This is going to be the vehicle for which they're going to drill down into what we actually teach in our classrooms, and they're going to say, not this, not this, not this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the awareness that comes with who am I to say so and so. But I think too, what we've been talking about is that it, that is one way also that we are pulled in to individualize this rather than think about it as a political project that needs our critical engagement. And it's the flip side of like the Tucker Carlson. When you look at him, you're like, does he have, is he humane enough to think genocide and eviscerating children and leaving them to decompose and, in their incubators is like, okay, but that says nothing. That is an individual appraisal of him.
And why are we thanking you for that anyway?
Exactly.
Like, so you have eyes. Well done. Yeah.
Yes, great job. It took this to make you realize that they were a genocidal entity beforehand. The 75 plus years beforehand did nothing to you. But I think that is the trap, is that we individualize it rather than can we continuously come back to this larger political project. And for me, I hear this a lot as a Lebanese person. It's just like, well, I'm not Lebanese, so I can't say anything about it. I'm like, okay, on the one hand, that might be the case, but do you see the Lebanese who are like fronted? Like, do you think that anti-Hizb or resistance Lebanese are the one? That's what you're saying. You're saying they have more legitimacy than those of us who are politically committed. And if we have a political commitment that has coherence around anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism, I'm just like, no, that you are the person I want to be talking about this. And this goes into the perverse use of it that you're talking about. And is like, and that's what I was saying before about the blackmailing of it, right? That there's this, of course, there's a perverse use, because it also invites us to think about these things as legitimate on their merit in and of themselves, like on the surface. Like if you have definitions, that those definitions are the things that are going to do the work.
Yeah.
Rather than what we understand that like you can have 1,000 definitions here, but those aren't going to be treated similarly because that's not how power works.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's part of what I understand you saying.
And they're used to whitewash, the situation of mandatory Zionism. They're only there in order to, shield the fact that what you really want to do is this thing over here. And so you're being used. If your argument is like, well, at least I'm going to get my definition of Islamophobia, then you have to understand that you're being played.
Yes.
And somebody needs to point that out to you. And, it does make one rather unpopular, but that person is me.
Exactly. And it's on that, it's usually me too. I'm in good company with you. But like, this is the thing, is like, for me, it's like, if you want to do that, all right, fine. I don't have respect for that political strategy. But you don't get to also claim innocence around the fact that this is going to be on the backs of some. And that's the thing for me. I'm just like, you think this is a strategy. You think there's a way around this. But then you also are telling me like that there isn't something else that's going to happen as a result to this. I think that's the piece that's hard for me to take. I'm just like, I need you to be honest about this terrain and on whose backs this ends up being.
But I think, coming back to the problem of individuals, I think the problem is that a lot of individuals, their first, and this is the problem is not necessarily with the individuals. The problem is with the structure in which they're forced to operate, which is the structure of the colonial state, capitalism, the intense, cutthroat neoliberal academy, now under attack as well. So it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. And in that context, individuals are going to make hay, because that is the nature of the game. And we see how certain people have positioned themselves around, and it's always been the case, but it's become accentuated around the genocide, where the people who are saying, well, at least I get this, and they're not willing to do what you say is like to admit, what they're actually doing, are kind of gaining sometimes from this situation. That's very, very uncomfortable to talk about, but it's become more and more the case. I mean, you can see it again with the indigenization agenda and what it lets through the door. Okay. I mean, part of what I spoke about in the chapter on the whole capture of indigeneity and the connection of this to the Zionist agenda of imposing this notion, this false notion that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, is that by mandating, so kind of setting up the structure in which that has a language within universities, it also provides a mechanism through which Jews who are Zionists are able to talk about their identity as Zionists, needing to be protected as indigenous by attaching themselves to other projects around institutional indigenization. And we can see this happening. So I spoke about the referendum, in relation to the kind of the capture of indigenous politics and the militant black no against the referendum and the indigenous voice to parliament. But the piece that I didn't speak about, which I discuss in the book, is the Zionist capture of that very agenda through the role being played by certain very central Zionist actors in Australia with a long history of legal work for certain indigenous land claims that through that door and through their recognition was kind of almost go-betweens by the colonial government, played a very central role in the entire referendum thing, to the extent that one particular law firm at the center of this renamed its Reconciliation Action Plan, which is some nonsense that most companies and universities and institutions have in Australia. They renamed it as something like Indigenous Self-Determination. So they really understand the language of this, or sovereignty, I don't remember anymore.
Yes.
But they've kind of used this in order to say, well, of course you must have this voice to parliament because you are the real indigenous people, just as we are the real indigenous people in our land, in
Right.
in West Asia. Of course, they wouldn't use that language. And I think that is so insidious to the, and I talk about one particular figure, Nova Paris, who was actually an Olympian who then became a senator and is now a mainstream Zionist activist. That's what she spends her time doing. And her presence at the opening of the Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem that was funded, it's an embassy for Indigenous people around the world funded by a right-wing Christian Zionist, with the full kind of obviously applause of the Zionist state, with people from various indigenous communities around the Pacific and so on in traditional dress, all there to kind of rubber stamp this Zionist project, which then, what I'm trying to say is kind of has a trickle down effect all the way into the institutions in this settler colony, where
Right.
this kind of like knitting together of certain indigenous interests, and let me be clear that the majority of indigenous people are completely and utterly against this and 100% with Palestine. But nonetheless, this positioning of particular people in high places within our institutions are doing that work of laundering Zionism and mandating it, as Ehab says, through the kind of indigenization narrative.
Right. And the disappearance of that hand-picked process you're talking about is part of the game. Just like they have to front that this is grassroots. I'm fascinated by this. Like they have to make it look like it's a grassroots thing. Versus what you're saying is you tell that story too, and you say this in the book. You're just like, if you really look at this, and Amaya does this in her book too. If you really look at this has never been a grassroots thing. It's been heavily endorsed, supported, moneyed, all these sorts of things. But the front is always that this is we're just indigenous people like anybody else. And here we are. And we're just trying to get our rights to our land like everybody else. Meanwhile, you have entire systems, infrastructures, and funding sources behind you, not because you're Jewish, but because you are fighting for a particular social order and a racial regime like you're talking about. It is it matches a white supremacist world order that that's the certain class of people we're talking about. That's why it doesn't matter where you are. It's a certain class of people. This is why I think does Israel, wags the dog, like, or whatever the fuck it, whatever that is like no, it's a class interests, and it doesn't fucking matter. It's like that's what ends up happening, which I think you do a really good job of too. But this is the other thing is, I'd love to hear your take on this, which I think you get at into the book, is like, it's also about mobilizing like what look like contradictions, because while they, you know, wail and moan and bemoan like the identity politics and all that shit, and you and I might have a revolutionary critique of that that's like devoid of power, they also heavily rely on it. That's the perversion in their own ways. So in my field, when all this shit was happening to I mean, still is, but and when it was in its height, where the Zionists were like sort of, when I was in the university setting and they were going after me in this way, one of the things that was fascinating was, on the one hand, they were just like, here's this woke, again, it was very much, here's this woke, you know, professor who cares about trans rights and all this sort of stuff. And they coined, I mean, they're not even, I wish they were like actually had imagination. They coined it critical social justice therapy. And like basically was like, ostensibly, I'm the leader of this cult, which they said, right? Which takes up racism, like anti-racism, BDS ideology, and trans ideology, right? But on the other hand, the argument was like, and therefore it makes Jewish students afraid, and Zionists can't fully like embrace their Zionism as a central piece of their Judaism. And I'm just like, can you see the issue here? And that's, but those contradictions don't matter to ideologues.
Well, apparently, I mean, okay, part of me goes, are these people just very stupid or so blinded by Zionist ideology? No, because we had a side conversation the other day about, let's call it this Kerry Nelson. I mean, that's his name, right?
Yes, that's his name.
And the reason it was on my mind is so crazy, because I just finished writing an article on Stuart Hall and Cedric Robinson and putting them in juxtaposition with each other. And there's a very, very important edited volume on cultural studies from 1992, I think, which is co-edited by Kerry Nelson, Lawrence Grossberg, and Pauline somebody. Sorry, I can't remember anymore. And you mentioned that Nelson was one of the people who attacked you for this so-called critical social justice theory. And I was like, is that the same guy from cultural studies? And apparently it is the same person. So then I went and I looked up Lawrence Grossberg, who was a very close acolyte of Stuart Hall, who in his essay, which was actually a talk that he gave in 2002, In But Not Of Europe, which is a brilliant piece in his selected writings on race and difference, Stuart Hall, he talks openly about Gaza and the West Bank, and he roots it back, you know, the question of Palestine back to Europe. And it's a brilliant paper. So these are people who were running with Stuart Hall back in the day, right? And Grossberg now has a Substack, like who doesn't have a Substack? He writes this absolute drivel about Jews being the most oppressed people in the world, and that Israel being so important to Jewish identity, all the things that you've said. And you think, this guy read Stuart Hall, and this is what he got out of it. So on one level, are you just so blinded by your ideology that you can't see it? I can't quite believe that. I think there is a reward for this kind of manipulation of identity in order to drive home a political ideology, which is necessary for, as we were saying before, the functioning of, you know, white supremacism, colonialism, and imperialism. But then using the vehicle of cultural studies, which, and this is something also about, you know, the whole question about the institutionalization of Black and ethnic studies and also cultural studies, and their complete divergence from their political project and their political route. I mean, it's interesting when you start, not to get down the rabbit hole of this too much because I've been in this paper, but when you start to look at the critiques that were coming from Black scholars right at the beginning at the Birmingham School in the 1970s, they were saying we can't speak about race and we need to speak about race. And that's where the birth of Black British cultural studies comes into being. But then the Americans took it and ran with it, and never mind the Australians, they took it and ran with it in a completely different direction. not everybody. I mean, there's some good cultural studies that's done, but so much of it is so depoliticized and so much a kind of a weapon and a tool in order to bed down this kind of liberal, obfuscation of reality, because the
Yes.
kinds of things that are studied in the name of the cultural studies are so far away from its roots in a kind of a real interest and commitment to class and race as problems that needed to be dismantled, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
really unconscionable,
Well,
in
it's
my
complete. Yeah, 100%. I love that. I love that what you just said, and it reminds me of like the parallel would be like you're not going to lose anything because for me these people, yes,
opinion.
they're ideologues and they are identified, like Zionism becomes the thing they're identified with, and it can hide in all these other places, and they can say, oh, I am, this is Carrie Nelson's whole thing. He made a whole, I mean, he's a washed up has-been who's using
Yeah,
this to make money because Israel, Times of Israel pays him money every time he writes a fucking
yeah,
hack job piece about me, right? We know that's part of it. But I think there is a way in which, he used to be the president of AAUP, and he sort of,
yeah,
talks about how he's made a career on defending Black folks and he's anti-racist,
yeah,
which is like the weirdo thing that you're talking about. But in the end, what the fuck does that mean when rubber hits the road and you are unwilling to actually disidentify from your white supremacist beliefs? Because
yeah,
this is where, because that shit, it wasn't touching it. Clearly, it didn't impinge on anything of yours. But the bottom line is this is the test. When we say it's a litmus test, it's to be like,
yeah,
what are you willing to disidentify from? And
yeah,
this is this. He's a Zionist through and through. That is the primary
yeah,
identity
yeah.
that you, as a mode of your white supremacy, by the way,
Hmm.
not Jewishness, as a mode of your white supremacy, I fully identified with Zionism. And
Yeah,
that's why this, like, and I think for them, they're like no contradictions because they'll full heartedly be like, I'm an anti racist and I'm not with Trump and his racism, but here's all this other thing. And of course, you know, I need to, one of the things he did was write a 15,000 word piece about me. The guy's obsessed
hmm.
and downloaded 9,000 of my tweets to
Wow.
give to any future Jewish students to make sure they can protect themselves against me. I mean, that level of like, that is an identification
Yeah.
that is unwell. Like I'm
No,
asking you
absolutely.
to square this. You are unwell.
Yeah, no, I mean it's obvious that this is what I mean. It's also reads from people who, whatever it is, survived for all of these decades in the institutions, wrote books, did things, were recognized. I'm not
Right.
saying I don't
Yes.
need that. I'm not interested in kind of institutional imprimaturs, but let's say these things exist, right? And then
Yes.
what you're coming out with is so childish. It's coming from a place that is not, I mean, to use their
Yes.
Eurocentric language, is not rational, right? It's not
Yes.
logical. There's something else there. This thing I read in Grossberg's piece about, you have to recognize, even if you don't see it, that Jews are the most persecuted people in the world. I think there's something so needy about that whole thing. But then what I'm more interested in is how it's used in order to do all manner of other things that
Yes.
institutions represented by these kinds of people say that they're committed to. So it brings me back to this university, definitions of racism
Yes.
and the indigenization piece, because the thing that people need to see is that the things that these institutions say that they're committed to, they're not committed to them either, right? They will
Mhm.
dump you as soon as they can, because the real
So
agenda is
quickly.
really, really something else. And even, to be honest with you, people like Nelson and Grossberg themselves are used in this whole thing, because they're not, they're awful and all the rest of it. But that kind of like that cry for help kind of language is then
Yeah.
what gives the discourse to managers. And I'm seeing it play out in my own place right now without taking names, but people who are not Jewish, right? But who have such an intense philo-Semitism that they're using to ram Zionism down the throats of everybody, but also, and this is the really insidious part to criminalize and police and punish
Yes.
students and academics and students and workers at the university and people in the local community, to the extent of, like, bringing metal detectors to graduation, which is unheard of because a few students wore a keffiyeh one day. I wore a keffiyeh at the graduation, this kind of thing. It's
Yeah.
and I said this to somebody recently who was talking about some personal relations that she had with Zionists that she didn't know how to navigate. And so when I said, this thing has infiltrated to the level of interpersonal and intimate
Yes.
relationships. And that's why it's so successful. Because this person was saying to me, I don't really know what to think. And it was interesting because I was reading your book at the time. It was so funny. I was reading your book and I was like, Lara says, because she was saying, I don't know what to think because I've been so, literally, she didn't use that language, but intruded upon, by all of these conflicting ideas. And because I don't really know that much about the history of this thing, which I was like, okay, you do need to learn, but
we can take
whatever.
care of that.
Go and read a book. But the point is, yes, it is. And coming back to the racial regime, it is there to confuse you. So when people use this super emotive language that they may or may not mean, yes, maybe it's really intensely felt for whatever reason, go and deal with it with your therapist or whatever, but like they really, really feel that way. But that can be used by people whose intention is a completely different one. A completely different one. I mean, part of for me, it all comes back to this stuff about Indigenous representation and reconciliation in the Australian context. Part of the reason you have something called reconciliation action plans that are in all these businesses, it was brought in by the Business Council of Australia in the 1980s, which I read about in a very interesting report called Driving Disunity by an old unionist about the whole politics of Indigenous politics in Australia, and how there was a decision in the 1980s that as Indigenous people were getting more support in the community for land back, and there was more militancy around this, the business leaders and the government went, oh, hang on a second, we've got to give them something, we've got to throw them something. And the same actors who came up with the reconciliation language and all the rest of it in order to not deal with, in order to really shut down the whole land back agenda, those same actors are at the forefront of mandatory Zionism today. They're literally the same people, like not the same kind, like the same people. It's a through line from this shit about reconciliation to this mandatory Zionism story, and literally calling police on students into campus.
Right. Yeah. That's the political project, which is why there's a through line.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you have to see in this overarching dimension.
Right. So we're getting to wind down mode. So I want to make sure to check in with you if there's anything that we haven't gotten to that you feel you want to comment on. And anything that you want to flesh out a little more. I heard you say, I don't know if 8 minutes is enough time to see how people misuse racial capitalism, but wherever you want to go or you feel might be important, anything you want to leave our audience with around your book or anything at all.
Oh, I mean, I could go in any number of directions. I mean, if people want to hear briefly what I have to say about racial capitalism, I think it's quite straightforward.
I do.
Okay. I think racial capitalism is not racism plus capitalism. And I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding of at least what Robinson meant by racial capitalism, in my understanding. And I hope that I'm not wrong. I'm, happy to be told that there's more to the story than I haven't seen. But I really think what Robinson is doing, and in a sense, and this is a bit, I'm a very big nerd when it comes to race theory. I'm just, this is the kind of stuff I talk about in my group chats. So forgive me if it's not that interesting to everybody. But I think you need to, everything that I do in terms of my writing and so on, I try to situate it. This is why I'm inspired by Stuart Hall talking about the conjuncture, right? It's really, really important to situate whatever work we're doing in the context that we find ourselves in. So Robinson, when he wrote Black Marxism, it was a project, obviously he'd already been working on it, but he kind of was working on it intensely and finalizing it when he was in Britain during a fellowship, at which time he came into contact with people from the Institute of Race Relations and other radicals and thinkers who were there at the time. And many of the people who were there were exiled South African Marxists who were talking about racial capitalism as a way of theorizing apartheid, right? So I think racial capitalism as a concept was in the zeitgeist. I'm pretty sure this was what was going on. But Robinson, obviously, this is like a massive book, Black Marxism, like, 380 pages and, 300 pages of notes, right? Or 400 pages of notes. So obviously he's been doing this work for a lot longer than that. And his project is trying to understand European civilization and what its legacy is, or what its ongoing project is, right? And he calls it racial capitalism. But it's a lot more than that, because what he's really trying to say is that racialism, the idea, he talks about the tendency which is inherent to European civilization to differentiate and not to homogenize, right? To constantly make demarcations between different groups of peoples that we constantly see. And we've just been talking about it for an hour and a half. That is literally what we're talking about, this constant division and grouping in order to rule, right? That logic, which he sees emerging or crystallizing at a very particular time during feudalism, is beneficial to capitalism, which is also burgeoning. And that taken together is what drives forth the project of European domination and Western stroke white supremacy through nationalism also, which for him is very, very important. And that's fundamental. So really what he's doing is writing a theory of history, right? And a way for us to understand the global order as we are still, as it's the shape that it still takes today. We're not in another global order. We're in that same,
that's right,
500-year kind of span that hopefully, we'll see the demise of, but probably, unfortunately, not in our lifetime. And that's really what the project is. So that's kind of like racial capitalism is an inadequate label for that. But you can see that there's so many forces that he's trying to describe and theorize and essentially then understand through how Black radicals have named it and talked about it, right? That's what he's trying to show us, that it needs some kind of label. And that's the label he came up with because that was in the zeitgeist of the time.
Right.
And so basically it's a key to a lot of other things that all the things that we're concerned by. So those kinds of, to my mind, those nitpicking that you see in so many articles and this new book by Nims around, well, what was he really doing there? And is it really, and is it class? Is it race? It's kind of like so irrelevant to the entire project now, beyond Robinson himself, but the entire project of Black radical and anti-colonial insurgent thinking,
right?
Indigenous thinking. Like we shouldn't be caring about those little academic art. I mean, they're interesting for nerds, as I said, but what we really want to do is like join onto that project, which is getting us to see how things function in order to work towards dismantle it. Because as Cabral says, like, we need a theory, right? We need a theory in order to be able to do this stuff.
That's right.
In order to practice against it.
That breakdown was fucking masterful, number one. So thank you. And the chat also is thanking you around that. And also, I think you're articulating one of the ways that we antagonize counterinsurgent. Because that's the thing, when we're pulled away to then have those arguments, what is it that we're actually being dislodged from?
Right, exactly.
And, yeah.
Exactly.
And it's
and I think it's annoying that, to come back again to this idea where, oh, Robinson wasn't actually interested in Black radicalism, like we real people are over here. And it's like, why are you making this distinction? Like everybody's involved, maybe from different angles, but everybody's involved. And I think, Charisse said an important thing on a podcast the other day, all of this nitpicking, they're all going to come and get you. That's what I said, like about the liberals and your CRT, like, why are you protecting it and saying, if I just don't talk about Palestine, then I'll be fine? It's like, no, they hate you as well. That's why and she said it very well, this whole racial communism thing, they're looking at things like CRT as well, even if it's very liberal and milquetoast. They're coming for that too. So you may as well get on the bandwagon with the rest of us. We're all going to the same camp.
Yeah, she was saying also that that report on Cuba also, like, it included Obama in it. Like,
I know, how funny. Yeah, but
I mean, that's the point.
Agenda. The birth citizen. What was it? The birther. movement and all this
Yes,
stuff.
that's
I
right.
mean,
That's right.
we can think whatever we want to think about Obama, but he's, for them, he's the same.
Yep.
That's why they kept
That's right.
referring to him as Hussein. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Of course. That was the best part of him.
Yeah.
Alana, it's so great to have this conversation with you. I've been very much looking forward to it. Folks, again, if you have not picked up this book, go ahead and pick it up. Also, before I forget, Alana, being the wonderful person that she is, organized a talk, a book event for my book at a bookstore in so-called Australia. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person, so it is online, and I'm going to drop the post because it is a fundraiser for families in Gaza. And so that's the most important thing for us. So if you want to join in, it's online, but most importantly, it also is a fund. All proceeds go to families in Gaza. So I'd love to see folks there, and I'll drop the link again. Please give generously if you can, and if not, pass it along to somebody else.
Because donations are really dropping off, and so we thought this was, I mean, apart from obviously wanting to be in conversation with you, we were sad you couldn't be in person, but this is a way for us to continue in our fundraising efforts. So thank you very much for agreeing to do it.
Of course, it's, I mean, there's nowhere else I'd rather be in. Anything to, like you said, the donations to Gaza have dwindled. Lifeline for Gaza also, please check their account, and you can see the people who need our support and our help and our uplifting, and you can see it in real time how donations have dwindled. So thank you so much again. I really appreciate it, comrades. And it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, folks in the chat, and we'll talk to you soon.